Micah just said after the shame of being captured and locked away for so long, he really just needed some time to find himself, and so he rode off into the trees on a mission of self-discovery. That was the last time anybody had seen Micah Bell. Disaster came and went. Victories arrived and passed. Time continued to tick by. But Micah Bell remained missing. And at first, there was no call for concern. He had embarked on quite a personal journey after all. A journey that would hopefully grant a better understanding of the power that surged within him. A journey that would hopefully grant him a better understanding of himself. But you see, the boys couldn't help feeling the worry that swelled more and more as the days flew by. Where was their friend sleeping? What was he doing? Was he still taking time to find himself, or had something sinister found him first? To put it simply, the boys just couldn't stand the uncertainty a minute longer, and so began their search for Micah Bell. The boys began their search closest by in Valentine, asking every single passerby they saw. You seen Micah Bell around by any chance? You know, he's got the big white hat with the black jacket. Coldest eyes, but big heart, big heart. You seen him? Nice skin, clear complexion, dude definitely moisturizes. Yeah. And he sort of walks like something bit him on the... You seen a scruffy looking dude with a mustache like the front of a bicycle by any chance? It was pointless. Of course, nobody had seen Micah Bell in Valentine. This was the last place you would go to find yourself. And so the boys decided it would be best if they extended their search just a little bit further. They searched rivers, stables, shacks, and shops. Oceans, mountains, trees, and crops. Bars, the stars, and inside Crocs. Cinemas. They would find him not. Not in prison? The boys were shocked. Did he leave a note? He must have forgot. Did he get shot up by a bunch of cops? Did he go to the tailor for some brand new socks? Saloons and rooms. They wouldn't stop. Was it Tahiti that he did flock? Bedrooms and places with trees to lop. Soon, the boys were all out of spots. Their friend was gone. Vanished. Lost. Perhaps it was time to accept their loss. So they found a spot where they would sob and jumped right down, where the garbage met the moss.
Hey Arthur, good to see you.
And there he was, a wild Micah way out in the sticks, still seemingly on his path to self-discovery. After a warm greeting and a stern speech from Arthur and Frank about not contacting them that closely resembled the ramblings of a worried mother, Micah burst to life, excited to reveal to the boys exactly what he'd been doing all this time. But he said that they needed to leave immediately, as a culmination of his 3 months of work and planning would go to waste if they didn't. So the boys rode off, Arthur and Frank completely clueless as to where they were headed, until Micah began to fill them in. In the 3 months that Micah was gone, only about a week of it was spent actually relaxing, doing nothing, repairing, and rejuvenating. The break itself was very short-lived, as something far more important had grabbed Micah's attention. He described spending that first week in the woods, desperately thinking of ways to get his abilities under control. He took the same route through the forest every single day. It was a long walk, the same path that they were riding at this very moment. And eventually, he took notice of a wagon, initially guarded by a single rider and one passenger, that passed through once every week. A wagon that was sometimes carrying supplies, and sometimes carrying prisoners. And that was when he realized that this wagon in particular belonged to none other than Strawberry Security. Rife with corruption, brutal beyond necessity, Micah had experienced their ways firsthand, and for the last 3 months, Micah had been making life very difficult for these bad men, intercepting the wagon every week, freeing those undeserving of their punishments, and delaying the repair of Strawberry security by stealing the supplies and giving them to those who were more deserving. Micah revealed that he had come to terms with the fact that maybe his abilities could never truly be controlled, but if they were going to exist at all, he was going to use them for good. I'm pretty sure that majority of you already know what I'm about to say because it's become a bit of a staple to the start of these videos. But for the first couple of attempts, my brain went to Tiny Town. I had no fucking clue what I was doing. This was all about getting a scope for not just our objective, but also our limitations. So to begin with, I hung back and watched as Micah and the enemies did their thing. The game had provided us with the objective to attack the guards and steal the stagecoach, which was good, you know, not a bad objective, but I was hoping more to maybe get rid of the first part and run with the second bit. The first failure was a personal death, which at the time seemed odd because I'd sworn I had full health. I fucking did have full health. And so, being pretty certain that I had already found out how this mission was going to frick me, I rode ahead just to confirm my suspicions. Did he just shoot me in the armpit? Yes, he did indeed shoot Western Jesus directly in the armpit. Once again, an instant death, while, once again, on full health. So to cut my discovery short, this spot right here was our cutoff point. If we don't steal the stagecoach by the time we reach this bridge, we can be instantly killed, which really sucks. Because even if I hung right back where nobody could hit me, the instant death would be swiftly passed on to Micah like some sort of disease. But it's okay, because we were so early into this mission with so much left to try and so much left to discover. Of course, considering we just started, the mission was still in that fresh, juicy fruit stage, you know what I mean? I wasn't gonna let myself worry until we hit the Sultana phase. It was time to actually interact with Strawberry security and their wagon full of supplies. Immediately, my plan was to just stop the wagon first, tie up all of the enemies, and then escape. That seemed like the most basic approach. And I knew that I could just restart in the event that I did accidentally kill someone, but pulling this guy off the wagon and watching as he was crushed and trampled under the weight of 4 horses and a wagon loaded with supplies gave me an unreasonable amount of anxiety. But he was fine. So I took off again, desperate to catch up to the wagon before it crossed into the cutoff zone. I lassoed the driver while taking copious amounts of lead to the noggin, but came to find that the driver here had been a lot less fortunate than his passenger. So this was the general plan that I ran with for a while. It seemed simple enough. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of room for error in terms of timing and making sure nobody died, including myself, but the objective at a base level was quite simple. As long as I restrained all of the enemies first and made off with the wagon in time, we would be fine. If you're waiting for the catch, I'd just like to inform you that you will not be at all disappointed. Because if it is a catch that you're looking for, tell me if you've heard this one before. The enemies die when you take them off their horse. I'm talking instant, not alive mode. On the horse, a ridiculously high damage dealing warrior. Off the horse, wet noodle. Lifeless, wet noodle. And you might be wanting to ask, why? Why would that happen? And I can tell you with the utmost certainty that I have no fucking idea. But look, it wouldn't be TGB without some ridiculous, nonsensical, life-draining bullshit to put a gigantic boulder in my path to success. It just wouldn't be the same. But that wouldn't stop us, okay? Because this mattered to Micah. And if it mattered to him, it mattered to the boys. So you can bet your favorite fucking pair of socks that they were gonna help him in any way they could. Let me give you all the rundown real quick. My go-to right now was to stop the wagon as far away from that cutoff point as I could, so that we had plenty of time to figure this shit out. I knew that old mate in the red coat could survive being thrown off the wagon, so hijacking it rather than lassoing somebody off of it was much quicker and much safer. I also discovered that he was among the first to be killed by Micah.
Oh my fucking god, she fucking dead.
Which seems like insignificant information, but this gave me a little hope that maybe I could leave most of the confrontation up to him while I acted as a distraction. It had worked in the past, so I thought, why not now? I decided to stick by Micah every chance I could, as at least he could provide some cover while I moved around to convince the game I was actually being active in the mission. Seems like a normal process to the start of a mission, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. While I definitely understood that these guys were, for some reason, very powerful on their horses, I didn't exactly understand how they were killing Arthur so abruptly. Here, you can see I had enough health to survive at least a couple more shots. Here, you can see I had fortified health from a tonic I drank. Here, you can see I was on pretty much full health, and yet Arthur was dying instantly. Similar to how the deaths worked at the cutoff point. Something was definitely going wrong. So after a plethora of instantaneous deaths, I took my strategies in a slightly different direction. You know, it's a shame I always have to leave out so much of the things that I attempt in these videos because, I won't lie, it honestly fucking baffles me how genuinely dumb some of the things I try are. And surprise, surprise, nothing I had tried so far was working. But as a little change of pace, here's what I actually did understand about this mission so far. I can hijack the wagon and stop it early, but it kicks me off automatically. No, that is not me leaping from the wagon like a maniac, okay? The game will not allow you to get on and drive off until I assumed all of the enemies were taken care of. Another thing I knew was that the minute old mate Redcoat was taken off that wagon, Western Jesus had seconds to live. Mere seconds. The men on these horses were armed with more than the standard revolvers and rifles. Something more sinister was definitely afoot. So upon coming off the wagon, what did this short lifespan mean? Well, this eliminated any chance of me successfully tying someone up, even if they were off their horse in the first place, because I had absolutely no time to do it. The furthest I got with even disarming somebody was getting them to throw Micah off his horse. And this was something that couldn't even be tested in terms of potential effectiveness because I'd be gunned down a second later. I also knew that I couldn't ride ahead of the cutoff point because once the enemies caught up, I was automatically one shot from death. Basically, my interaction with the enemies either resulted in Arthur's death or an enemy's death at the hands of Arthur, both of which was a big no-no. So, this is starting off very negative, but as usual, there was at least something in the mess of all this that kept my attention. You know, something that kept me wanting to pry for a potential solution. And that little something, that little glimmer of hope, was that Micah could still kill enemies. He was in excellent form, actually. Clearly, the 3 months of training had his skills more refined than ever before. It's just that whatever Strawberry Security had up their sleeves all of a sudden wasn't allowing Arthur to stay alive long enough to see things through. It's almost as if they knew he was coming, as if they'd prepared specifically for him. But how would they have had any idea he was coming? Not even Micah knew that. Not even the boys themselves knew that. So the issue wasn't at all Micah. He could kill at least one of the enemies. At least one, I knew that for sure. But I wasn't able to stay alive long enough to see if he could kill more. So, if our inability to survive long enough to see what would happen was in fact the problem, I had a plan. I hijacked the wagon, for some reason disarmed one of the enemies, but then I ran away and hid in a lovely patch of grass. Far away enough that I wasn't being shot at, but close enough to observe the action. I checked the map and my suspicions were somewhat confirmed. This was seemingly not an issue of whether or not Micah could kill the enemies for us. It was an issue of the mission ending too soon for him to do it. We've determined that my brain is small, okay? So don't blame me when I saw 3 enemies down, up from the usual one, and got a little too eager to get a closer look. But you know what? The death didn't matter. At all. Because we had reached an important part of the process quite quickly. Doing these videos is kind of like becoming Sherlock Holmes, okay? Bear with me here. The leads we chase down are strategies, and usually a beefy strategy full of juicy potential doesn't come around for quite a while. But here, we had something pretty significant to chase down quite early. The only downside was, the margin for error in this mission, as I said before, was tiny, due to the time limit on Arthur's life and the time limit to stop the wagon. This is all basically a long way of me saying that, hey, this mission may have presented me with a lead to chase down pretty early, but it was still kicking my ass. But anyway, with my newfound strategy, I knew very well that this was about to be a waiting game. Sounds fine, right? Well, two problems with that. One, I had absolutely no idea if this was going to work at all, let alone how long I was going to have to wait if it did. And two, even by this point, I had long passed the one-shot threshold. After leaving that wagon, I only have about 30 to 40 seconds before Arthur can be gravified with a single shot. This means that I cannot allow my curiosity to spike. Arthur cannot leave the safety of these bushes to get a closer look at what's happening, and I must rely solely on the map to tell me if this strategy is actually worth pursuing. I could only catch a glimpse of what was happening every now and again as an enemy darted into view while Micah shot past the bushes. Arthur, of course, felt horrible that he couldn't help more, but it was quite obvious that whatever was going on with those guards almost rendered him useless. It was up to Micah to fight this fight, and the boys could only sit back and hope that his skills were up to the challenge. I checked the map every couple of minutes, and before long, Micah had reached the 3-kill mark we saw earlier. So far, the highest I'd seen. Whether or not he could take out another enemy would determine if this was a solution worth waiting for. 3 enemies remained for a long time. I was beginning to wonder if it was going to budge at all. Trust me when I say, I stayed behind that tree for as long as I possibly could. But eventually, my patience cracked. I carefully moved into another position while the battle continued, getting close enough to observe, but also close enough to throwing all of my waiting out the window. Which would have been a real shame because not long after, Micah came through with yet another kill. This absolute beast had just confirmed to me that this was indeed worth waiting for. I didn't know if Micah would be able to kill the next 2 enemies, because it was definitely possible that they were scripted for Arthur. But at least now I had a little bit of hope to hold on to. However, I started getting reckless, desperate to get a look at how this battle was going down, risking it all and moving a little too close to the action each time. This was not a battle of raw power, but rather one of endurance. And right now, Micah was definitely holding his own. And as I crept back into cover, Micah only proved his might further by defeating yet another opponent. Unfortunately, my excitement grew alongside a burning impatience. I needed to properly see what was going on. Micah was holding his own against a small army, a historical event was taking place, and I couldn't bear to miss another second of it. And on top of that, it really got me thinking, who exactly could hold up against Micah for this long? I'd been waiting quite a while at this point, and even the 1v1 had drawn on longer than what I was expecting. Whoever Micah's opponent was no ordinary employee of Strawberry Security. And the longer I watched, the longer I questioned exactly how he'd survived this long. He was putting the pressure on Micah, really keeping him on the back foot more often than not. Sitting there, tanking shot after shot. It was almost as if Micah's attacks simply did not faze him. And that was when Arthur got thinking. This man's power. It reminded him a lot of something quite close to home. He could sense it, and he didn't know exactly why, but the nature of this man's power had him scrambling for a memory of his own to attach it to. He called to Micah from the bushes. It was his horse. His horse was enhancing his power. It had suddenly become so obvious to Arthur that that was the source. And if Micah wanted to beat this guy, his current approach just wasn't going to cut it. He needed to attack at the source.
Hurry, get up. I'll drive.
And just like that, the horse bonder was defeated. Simply knocking a horse bonder from their horse disconnects them from the source of their power. This was the first time Arthur had ever encountered a horse bond in action, though he'd heard tales of them in the past and, until now, remained unsure if they'd even existed. As the legend describes, disconnection from their source leaves them weak and easily defeated, because unlike Frank and Arthur, Their connections are formed artificially, with a spell. So while Frank, Arthur, and Micah got to cheering each other on in light of their new victory, Arthur couldn't help but wonder, who on God's green earth was taking time to horsebond a security detail? And why? Jesus, man. I didn't think we were getting through that without at least killing that last dude, so yeah, Jesus. The stress of these missions is gonna have Arthur looking 80 at 30 if this shit keeps up. So the boys could finally climb aboard the wagon and began making their escape, in pursuit of giving the supplies inside to those who were more deserving. But Micah warned Arthur to keep his eyes peeled, as it wasn't unusual for there to be additional guards stationed on the nearby pathways.
Shit! Now we're being robbed! Get across the river!
Strawberry Security had finally put proper measures in place to combat Micah's recent interceptions, and he honestly wasn't sure if he should be more shocked that he was just violently thrown into the air by a surprise explosion, or more shocked that it took them this long to devise a plan to stop him. But regardless, the boys were in a very dangerous position now, as more and more enemies began moving in. So you might ask at this point, what exactly was my plan here? And to tell you truthfully, I didn't have one. I somehow forgot that this event even occurred within the same mission, and so I had no prior thoughts at all on how I was going to go about this. But one thing was for sure, there were a lot of people trying to kill the boys, and their confidence in numbers was blatantly obvious as they moved up closer and closer with every passing second. There were no defensive plays here, and running out of viable places to take cover quickly became a problem. I was taken off guard, not even trying to lasso anyone at this point, but rather scrambling around considering how I was going to approach this. First thing I became familiar with was just how dangerous being out in the open was. So many enemies dealing damage at once from so many different angles, in the trees, behind the rocks, wading through the river. These bastards were everywhere, and they were killing me a ton. We're 7 episodes in now. I don't need to tell you guys I died a lot of times, you get that. But what I will say is it didn't take long at all for me to have a fucking personal grievance with these guys. Maybe it was because I was still riding the high of my luck from just moments before. And maybe it was because progress was non-existent as death after death hammered my willpower into the ground. But what I think it was, above all, is that I almost thought we were getting back to basics with this one. The approach to this section seemed so simple right away, because it so closely resembled a type of mission we'd seen before. Every now and again, we get blessed with one of these missions that looks intimidating because of the sheer number of enemies, but in reality, because there isn't some secret weapon the game pulls on us, like, oh, I don't know, an enemy in a fucking unreachable position, it's simple. Avoiding damage and restraining the enemies is all it takes in a mission like that. And this was a mission like that, but not really. I guess you could say this was a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of deal, because I did not consider this mission as one of those blessings I just mentioned at all. So here's what was really mashing my sanity into a fine paste, spreading it on some fresh whole grain bread, and proceeding to quickly devour it in a few bites. My plan to begin with was to test the waters with a combination of disarms and hog ties. In any situation, this is usually what I try first. Massive roadblock here was me being demolished before I had the chance to really get anywhere. The absolute worst part about this was not the deaths themselves, but the fact that they were being caused in a very similar way to before. Lots of health 1 second, and not a drop of it after a single shot.
This sucks, man.
Was this caused by a time limit? Was it caused by the positions I was moving into? I had no idea, because after a good deal of attempts, the one-shot death seemed about as consistent as my upload schedule. Not fucking very. One attempt I could survive for what felt like ages, and then the next, I could barely touch an enemy before I had my face wiped off. There didn't seem to be a pattern I could follow at all, let alone a hint at what caused this exactly. On top of that, just to make things a tiny bit more frustrating, it seemed like an old friend from the past had come back to haunt us, because word of 3-Gun Gary's battle strategies had apparently leaked. It was confirmed early on that Micah was scripted to kill these enemies, which was very relieving, but I didn't have any idea if some were to be left for Arthur, and this was particularly worrying considering just how many enemies there were, as I obviously didn't want to leave this mission with any knockouts at all if possible. So many small details building and building to form significant obstacles is always prominent in this series. But there was an extra element in this fight alone that had me amassing a sickening amount of deaths before I even know what approach I wanted to take. The enemies here were especially aggressive, more so than I'd ever seen in a case like this. Usually, from what I've seen so far, when enemies are grouped into big numbers, they're scripted to stand their ground, hold down some cover, and play it quite safe. Never have I seen the enemies apply pressure like this before. These guys reeked of confidence, constantly converging on my hiding spots, hunting me down. It was honestly fucking terrifying. And the worst part of all was I had no idea when I might be met with a one-shot death. It was just lurking. It could come at any time. And just knowing that it was a possibility, no matter how much progress I made, was severely frustrating. A lot of dumb ideas were tried, and unsurprisingly, every single one of them failed. So it wasn't long before I was back to gambling the one-shot possibility by trying to make progress with disarms, taking the enemy's toys away and leading them to certain death at the hands of one of the greatest warriors to ever grace the planet. What frustrated me even more was how foolproof this plan was in theory and almost in practice. The longer I survived, the more progress could be made. Obviously, it was that simple. As long as I could lead the enemies into an easier line of fire, they were to be picked off without a problem. But this random one-shot curse was a plague to any progress I made. I had no idea if it was random, or if I just couldn't take a single fly shit of damage after a certain amount of time. All I knew for sure was that it was the only thing holding us back from completing this mission, potentially without a single knockout or kill. And my patience was thinning fast. Now look, trust me when I say I would love to present you all with one of those victorious outros, okay? I love doing those. Weston Jesus, Frank the telekinetic horse, Micah the unstoppable, back together once more, side by side in battle, protecting the innocent and crusading against the evil that dare present itself. Those outros are my favorite. But, as unfortunate as it is, I don't think I have one. Because sometimes, this game is just really dumb. After a gross amount of attempts at disarming the enemies, lassoing the enemies over and over, only to be killed in one shot for a reason I still could not figure out, the game decided to do something different. I don't know why it did, which is something I find myself saying more and more as this series goes on, but it did. I've looked back on everything I recorded, and I still have absolutely no idea what sparked the sudden change, but let me just show you. And you know what? Matter of fact, maybe I do have a victorious outro for you. Upon being reunited, our boys had already faced many a challenge. Members of a corrupt organization with powers enhanced by a suspicious and unknown entity tried desperately to stop them, but our trio fought on. And now, additional members of that same cutthroat organization threatened to snip their objectives short once again. But after many attempts, the game decided not to fuck me over and
Christ, these videos are rating me horribly.
Maybe I wasn't playing aggressively enough before, or maybe I was playing too aggressively. I don't even know at this point. But for some reason, the one-shot curse was miraculously lifted, and the boys could work in perfect synergy the way we all know they can. Instead of being downed the second I was shot, Weston Jesus suddenly ate bullet after bullet, while Micah served an unholy amount of lead to the enemies that stood before him.
Oh my god, he on X Games mode.
Bodies dropped quicker than 8-year-old me showing off at a school fire drill, but none of these guys were rolling around afterwards. Micah cleaned them up with the smoothest assassinations I'd seen in a while. This man was definitely in his prime, and Frank and Arthur couldn't be happier to fight alongside him once more. Soon, the last enemies were taken care of.
I'm a fucking tank.
But not a moment of calm had time to settle in, as an additional wagon full of hostiles rolled over to the river. The fight continued, but the rest of the battle was brief, as the sheer power of the West's greatest protectors proved too much for for their final assault. I really didn't want to end this video with another blatant, I have absolutely no fucking idea why that happened moment, but I have absolutely no fucking idea why that happened. This game works in very mysterious ways, but I can tell you, I was on this mission for a very long time before that happened. As I said before, the game just doing random things where it changes something, sort of how the enemies wouldn't attack last episode, that's happening more and more, and I'm not sure I like the thought of the game being able to do random things and making it more difficult, but hey, it made it easier in this case, so who would I be to complain if a miracle is what gets us through missions like that? Anyway, our boys may have emerged from battle victorious once again, but it was still no time to relax, as their job was not yet complete. It was time to collect the contents of this wagon they'd fought so hard for and distribute the money, the food, and the general supplies to those around the West that truly deserve it. And with our trio finally back together, stable and stronger than ever before, it was about time they ramped up their efforts from here on out. With so much good left to do, and so many people left to save, our heroes would need to work harder than ever before, especially considering the forces that were gearing up to stop them.